Hello and welcome to episode 233 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about the second week of the Major 3 qualifiers. After last week's minor, we're back to the online matches, and I think there was some pretty interesting results, and I think specifically we'll talk probably at length about Miami Heretics and FaZe Vegas, probably two of the more interesting teams coming out of this weekend. But we also have some more CDL, more broad news to talk about and how it might relate to the CDL and COD esports. But before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. I don't got really much to preface here. Pretty straightforward week of CDL matches. We had similar predictions, and there were only a couple of shockers, but obviously still some good stuff to talk about, and I'm ready to dive in.
Let's start with what I texted you. I think it was on Thursday night, and I was at work and I saw this article about Live Golf. And some of you are probably wondering, how does Live Golf tie into the Call of Duty League? But so Live Golf is primarily, or I think maybe entirely, funded by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which is basically the Saudi government trying to gain influence. And we've talked about the topic of sports washing, and that's really where it comes from. They've poured money into soccer, into boxing, into esports, as well as we've seen with the Esports World Cup, as well as Team Falcons, or Falcons Esports, the parent company of the Riyadh Falcons. And I saw this article, and it said that the Saudis were essentially pulling their funding from Live Golf, and that the golf league that was trying to compete with the PGA Tour was effectively going to die unless they could get like a massive investment from some kind of outside resource. And in addition to Live Golf dying, this article said that over the last several weeks, the Saudis have bailed on a Winter Olympics-style sports festival, sold one of their best soccer teams, all while shifting the strategy of their multi-billion-dollar investment fund that bankrolls it all. And that there is a new prospectus outlining its strategy for 2026 to 2030, which focuses on more internal investment while maximizing financial returns, strengthening investment efficiency, and increasing private sector participation. A lot of that just to say that they are definitely not going to be spending nearly as much money on kind of these sports washing endeavors, maybe specific ones like trying to get a World Cup and trying to kind of really make it like a big global event. But I texted you that, and I wanted to talk about that because it really ties into the esports centric push that they have done over the last several years, both with Falcons, but also Esports World Cup. Obviously, the Esports World Cup actually takes place in Saudi Arabia every year, and I think it's important to bring it up because we don't know how this will actually affect what the Falcons have been doing in the CDL. We talked about in the offseason and earlier this season that they reportedly paid Celia more than anybody else is being paid in the CDL so far this season. They have Pred, who they signed last season. They have a pretty expensive roster and have seemingly been more willing to invest into the league and its players than the team that they that used to occupy that spot, the Paris and Vegas Falcons, or Vegas Legion, excuse me. But at the same time, we don't know what the future holds for them and whether they'll be able to do that even this coming off season. So I wanted to kind of throw it to you that if this does end up affecting both the Falcons and the Esports World Cup, how do you think that kind of affects the CDL broadly? And what do you think about that potentially being the case where they just aren't going to be a contender for those top players anymore?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty ignorant to a lot of this situation, so my comments are mostly going to be pretty broad, and I don't think it's going to be too groundbreaking of opinions from me, but um, I think there are multiple massive implications that can be taken away from this news. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in what the Saudi government is investing in and not investing in, as well as like how that stuff is perceived. But from a very rudimentary angle, I would assume that video games have a bigger worldwide appeal than golf. I know golf has been
Mm-hmm.
growing in popularity in recent years, but I feel like just like there are more people in more parts of the country that care about video games as opposed to the number of people who care about golf. Um, so I'm not sure. Like maybe this is a case where it's like golf is the first thing being cut because it's at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
You can also look at this as something like if they're cutting golf, it could impact the investment in esports and in Call of Duty in particular. If it does come to hitting esports, you would assume like just based on you know, some of the esports I know the EWC is involved in and stuff, Call of Duty might be on the chopping block just compared to like CS, League of Legends, like some of the bigger ones. So definitely a bit concerning from that perspective. Obviously, there are the people of the opinion who are like, well, yeah, good riddance. Don't want that influence from uh, you know, the Saudi government or whatever involved in esports and whatever. I think that's a bit of a different topic than exactly what we're on right now. But I think this could definitely impact how much money is being spent by some of these teams. It could impact whether they're involved at all, especially if you look at Falcons and what Falcons is investing in. Like you said, like especially, I mean, how this affects the CDL from a Falcons perspective, we've been talking about roster changes for a while now with them. This would seemingly be a perfect excuse for them to cut ties with Selim and Pred in the offseason and go for an all Saudi roster because that would be in theory much cheaper than like they could probably fund an all Saudi team for half of what they're paying Selim on his own. In theory at least. Um so that's obviously one way of looking at it. You can look at it in terms of EWC, like will that even exist still? They have seemingly invested a ton of money into like that whole like I don't even know what it's called, like that area where EWC is. It's basically like a hub and like it's like an esports town for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
descriptor. Um, so like is that just gonna disappear overnight? EWC is gone and what does it mean for that? Maybe it affects the prize pool at EWC. Then we're looking at a different, conversation around that tournament entirely because that's why people are comparing that to champs in recent years because of the prize pool mostly, not because of the pedigree associated with the tournament and all that entails. So, um, does this impact EWC happening in general? Does it impact Call of Duty being involved in EWC? Lots of questions that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head here without really being too
Mm-hmm.
involved in this situation. And I think it's definitely, I mean, and to go a step further, we've talked at least over the last off season and maybe the last two off seasons about Saudi teams potentially buying into the CDL in
Yeah.
recent years or potentially being associated with that most likely I'm not gonna say most likely that could be impacted here and impact whether they are deciding to allocate funds to a Call of Duty team or not. Um, in turn, that could impact expansion for the league as a whole, and we talked about that last episode with the Daniel Say flank stuff. So if you didn't check out that episode, you can go ahead and do that. But like they're basically saying that they want to have 12 sustainable teams. And if this live golf stuff is happening, does the CDL consider a Saudi backed team to be sustainable and like a worthwhile partner if like they could just pull the plug at a moment's notice now. So definitely lots of questions involved in this on my end.
Yeah, I think this is also just a really fluid situation. A squad wiper in YouTube chat, he said the Saudis thought that they could overspend on brands, teams, and players, then sell it for a profit, like an appreciating asset. And they said the Saudis probably didn't realize how much of golf tours are subsidized by sponsors. I will say to that first point, I don't think that they actually believed that they were going to be able to come in and like turn a profit because their strategy in their investments has been to essentially flood the market and overpay for talent in order to just get any kind of foothold in that market. I think boxing is probably the best example. Or I get no, soccer is definitely the best example because they offered like Ronaldo like $100 million, and they offered Messi, $100 million, and a lot of these other players in order to bring attention to the Saudi professional league, or I don't remember what it's exactly called, but they wanted their soccer league and those teams to be seen as kind of like something akin to the Premier League or like the Spanish league and all of that. But at the end of the day, people realize like this is really like a low level league. It's kind of like if MLS just decided to spend $100 million on bringing over these really top tier players, I think people could see through that, and that's essentially what's happened. Same thing with Live Golf. They paid those guys like tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to start their own league, and that obviously hasn't worked out because people don't really care about that. I think people care very much about the PGA Tour brand and the events that are tied to that. Esports is different though, and I should mention like esports is so young and so new in comparison to the PGA Tour, to professional soccer. I don't know what else they're trying to get into in boxing and MMA. Like that, those are like very well established sports and leagues. With esports, we're kind of a baby, like there's like a lot of opportunity to kind of get in and just absolutely like take over how esports is kind of run. And I think the Saudis also bought EA Sport, or not EA Sports, EA Electronic Arts. So that's something to watch out. They bought ESL, if I'm not mistaken. So they have like some pretty big parts of our community. And then of course, Esports World Cup. And it seems like they have taken over esports in a way that they haven't nearly been able to do in these traditional sports, just because there's just too many traditional powers to play with there. But I also want to say that like this situation is incredibly fluid, and we won't know probably for a little bit like how this will actually affect esports and the CDL, because I think we have to just mention it. The war in Iran has affected oil prices like considerably. If you've had to get gas recently, that's probably something that you've noticed. But the Saudi government is like entirely, like their wealth is essentially entirely tied to the price of oil and how much they're able to sell. And we're going through like a pretty major crisis with oil at the moment because of the war in Iran, and also because there's a war like between like Iran, Lebanon, and the United States and Israel. How will people be able to like, will it be safe for people to travel to the Esports World Cup in like a month and a half or 2 months to go to Saudi Arabia? It might not be advisable by the United States government to actually go fly out to Riyadh and like spend a few days in Saudi Arabia. And on top of that, like I think the big thing that the Saudis have been trying to do in regards to their investments is, one, they want to be seen as like a major player. They want to be seen as like the same way that like people would go to Las Vegas to see boxing fights or MMA fights, or that you go to New York City or LA or London or one of these big cities to go see these major sporting events. I think that they wanted to be seen as that, but they also wanted the tourism. They wanted people to come to Saudi Arabia to kind of experience Saudi Arabia. And if that isn't working, if that hasn't been effective, and then you have all these external factors like a war and oil prices really screwing that up, it might end up being pretty, smart to get out. And, they've spent apparently over $1 billion on Live Golf, which I did not know, but that's kind of chump change to them in many ways. And I'm sure they've spent considerably less on the Esports World Cup and Falcons, but if they're not making any money, and I don't think that they are, because we'll get to it, we'll talk about Space Station and, whether like you can actually make money in the CDL, but I don't know if they're going to be able to like turn a profit on these things. And if times get a little bit tougher, then sometimes you have to make cuts. And I think that might be where we're going. Also, like the CDL itself, that'd be a big blow to them if the Saudis decided not to be involved anymore. Like not only from a Falcons point of view, but like you mentioned, like there's a definite tie between the Esports World Cup and the CDL now, and like the CDL regularly acknowledges it. And I think it might be like an actual sponsor or something like that with the CDL. So like there presumably is like actual money being exchanged there, and that the CDL would lose out on if the Saudis are no longer interested in esports or not investing nearly as much in esports. And they, like you said, they might actually go, like, if maybe they don't pull out entirely, but maybe they focus on, like, let's just stay with Valorant and or stay with CSGO or stay with League of Legends or whatever the case may be. Like, we don't need Call of Duty. We don't need some of these fringe esports. We could just stick to like these core ones that might get us the most attention. So yeah, a lot to, I think that's a long-winded way of saying that we actually have no idea how this is going to turn out, but I did want to bring it up, right? Just to kind of discuss it, just kind of make note of it, because this could be like the biggest story in the CDL probably this year if, you know, the Falcons decide to pull out, and then you have one fewer team actually competing for these top players, which is something that we talked about, right? Last offseason was like, the Falcons are a player to get Celium, and they're a player to get Simp, and they're a player to get Scrap and Hydra and all of these players because they can actually spend the money. They can actually sign those checks, and in a way that a lot of these other organizations either can't or won't. And I think that at least it gave us the idea that, hey, maybe we'll see another championship contender pop up. That hasn't happened, and we'll talk about that. We have talked about that quite a bit, that they haven't been able to be competitive, but yeah, it might just completely go away. And like, who knows what the next team is to replace them, because I don't think that there's going to be another like big spender coming in right after the Falcons if the Falcons feel like this isn't sustainable for them. Let's move on then to Space Station, because this is kind of in a similar vein, I would say, in just the fact that the viability of the CDL has been brought up, and we talked about it at length. I went on a little bit of a tangent last week when we talked about what Daniel Tai had said about prioritizing sustainability and stability within the CDL in regards to expansion teams. And I think I rightfully called out bullshit and said that that's a ridiculous notion that the CDL has prioritized stability, because I mean, look at the teams that are within the CDL, and there are several teams that you can say are just decidedly not stable in any shape or form. And then Space Station, the CEO unit, he tweeted on, this was yesterday, so on Saturday evening, he addressed the rumors that we had heard about last offseason, that Space Station, there was considerable interest in buying into the CDL specifically for that Carolina Royal Ravens spot and replacing Carolina and potentially joining the league. He tweeted, and I'll just quote, "It was rumored SSG would be entering the CDL last year, and while we did discuss with multiple groups, we ultimately passed for a few reasons. What we found after deep diving into the economics is that the license, which would be transferred at a cost, was more of a liability than an asset. The real value is the brands attached to the license, making it hard to justify a heavy cost to obtain it. The cost to operate versus revenue potential would also make it impossible to be competitive in the current ecosystem. The other issue entering as a new organization was the lack of available talent to build around. Challengers does its job cycling new talent to the CDL teams, but lacks purpose for a challenger's teams to improve with limited opportunities to compete against the best. I would love to run a similar program like we did in Halo, but for Call of Duty, and hopefully one day we will get the opportunity if it ever returns to an open system." Which, again, that last point is like a real jab into the ribs for the CDL, because the whole point of the CDL in theory was to keep out the bad actors, to make sure that everybody is like the tippy top version of themselves, that everybody is willing to compete, everybody's able and willing to spend money and be like the most stable esports league that you can be within Call of Duty. So you limit it down to 12 teams. You make sure that you bring in Robert Kraft, or you make sure that you bring in the Minnesota Vikings owners, you bring in everybody. You know, the Surge were owned at least in part by the people that run the Canucks. So like, you have like these really non-endemic billionaire owners coming in, and then what happens is like everything goes to shit. COVID happens, and then you have these franchise fees, which are exorbitant, even by the standards that we had seen at those times, $25 million to get into a league that had proven, there's no way that some of these teams have even made $25 million in the 6 years that the league has been operating overall. So like, that was never going to be a smart investment. Those franchise fees get put back, they get waived. Teams are cycling in and out for the last 6 years. Teams are changing names, changing cities. and everything kind of seems to be in a little bit of disarray, despite Daniel Ty saying that there's been double-digit growth with the CDL every single year or whatever. And then we have Space Station CEO coming out and saying, like, it is just, he literally called it a liability. It is more of a liability than an asset to have the CDL spot, to have one of a dozen spots that there are in existence. He called that a liability rather than an asset. How do you feel about it? Do you feel similarly that this is actually more of a liability? I know we discussed like this kind of thing before, but how do you feel about this with someone who was, looking into buying into the CDL actually saying that?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of, like, without saying it the same exact way, it sort of sounds similar to what Zuma has been talking about recently, and saying that some of these teams are asking for like $6, $8, $10 million, whatever the exact number is. I can't really remember, but it's been a stupid amount of money that some of these teams are asking for from Zuma just to have the right to
Mm-hmm.
participate in the league. And it's not even like he said, like the brands associated. If Zuma or Bush or even like Omit, Team War, you could argue, some of those teams from challengers would have more brand appeal or brand acknowledgement than what has become of these bottom teams like Carolina and Vancouver and Cloud9 even this year, really. So um I agree on that front with what the space station guy was saying. I definitely do not agree with his second point though about like the lack of available talent to build around. I'll just, one point that I have been vocal about for years in terms of praising Boston, at least in the very early years, is their ability to enter the CDL and immediately identify the talent to form a somewhat competitive roster in year one after 11 teams had already been formed and players had already been signed. So I always said 44 players were off the market. They had to at best go for player number 45 in theory and go from there. And then Boston was still willing to host events. Boston was still somewhat competitive in earlier years. Obviously, times have changed a little bit on that front, but regardless, I don't agree with that point about the talent. I think you could argue from Space Station's perspective, probably would be a little more difficult for them to uh, identify talent without having some sort of partnership or
Mm-hmm.
hiring someone with COD experience just because they have that. I don't think they've done anything in COD. I could be wrong on that front. I know they've done stuff in Halo, obviously. Um, but if they had a COD team, it was like probably something very brief that I'm not aware of.
I don't remember one.
Um, yeah, so I honestly might be thinking of Spacely in my head, and shout out Mike, but uh, yeah, I think you know maybe it would be different from Space Station's perspective if the Legend experiment didn't go so horribly wrong for
Yeah.
Vancouver earlier this year, because they could have been like, okay, if Legend was able to make this transition, we can maybe bring over some of our Halo players if they are interested in competing in COD, and that would have been a cool storyline to follow for Space Station. It would have helped them potentially gain more fans in their first year, yada yada. It doesn't seem like that matters though, because it doesn't seem like they are going to be entering the CDL now anytime soon. I think that is a you know a bad thing in terms of what we've been talking about for years now in terms of potential expansion, or like you mentioned, getting rid of the bad actors and stuff. If these quote unquote bad actors are asking for a ridiculous amount of money for their spot just to get a paycheck before they bounce, a lot of these teams, like we've heard it from Zuma and we've heard it from Space Station, and that's just the teams we've heard it from. So it's obviously happening with other organizations behind the scenes, most likely. These teams are just going to wait it out. We heard Zuma ask Daniel Ty about the agreement between the CDL and stuff, and it is seemingly up in a couple years, 2 years, I believe, at this point. And when that happens, it's either going to have to get renewed or the CDL is going to take a new shape. And if it does take a new shape, that could be the opening to something different format wise for the CDL. We've already done CWL and CDL, so I don't know what way they can
Yeah.
form an acronym now. But Yeah, I mean, definitely an interesting tweet from the Space Station guy. I'm glad he brought it to light. Not fully in agreement with him on the player and talent perspective from his post, but I do agree with his viewpoint on the whole like acquiring the license side of it. Just doesn't make sense for these orgs at this point to essentially reward these teams that have been putting in the bare minimum work to try and get a seven-figure paycheck and just peace out, never to be heard from again.
I'm trying to like. I think you're right that there is enough talent to be like, you know, like a champs team or whatever. I do think that there's a case to be made that the teams that have come in the last say 4 years. So like thinking of the Boston Breach, the Miami Heretics, um, I just had the Falcons, like, you know, some of these like non-endemic or these organizations that haven't been in Call of Duty before. They have been able to get to champs, but there have been like no team that has entered after the CDL has begun, I don't think, has actually made it. Yeah, Genomates is the only one, right? Like and they haven't made it to like champs grand finals, and that's kind of the point I was making. Was like,
oh, well, they won them.
Yeah, like yeah, and that's a pretty amazing thing considering how bad they were last year as well. But like if you look at it, OpTic and FaZe and LAT and the subliners obviously were like not non-endemic, but they had like, you know, 3 years in the CDL from the very beginning to actually make it to the champs grand finals and all of that. And we've seen like the surge and all of that, and they've been there since the beginning. But we haven't seen like these teams that have come in since the CDL started and been like really there at the end of the year a lot of times. You know, with Boston, I think Boston's probably the closest because they got to third at champs last year, and like that's a crazy thing that happened. But like that was also a very fluky thing. You know, that wasn't something that were like, you know, they built up this amazing roster over years, and like no, it was just, you know, they stuck with the same guys, and you know that worked for that event and a few matches here and there, but it was certainly not something that anybody had expected. And I think that you can make the point, and if you want to be kind of like, you know, on unit side in this, it's that, you know, these teams that are coming in, like they're at such a major disadvantage when they come into the league because all of these other organizations have multiple years to really ingratiate themselves with these players, and maybe more importantly the player agents, and you know, been able to kind of build those relationships so that when free agency does happen in the summer, they can say, hey, like, you know, we've been working on this and this, and we've, you know, kind of rubbed elbows and we've crossed paths before, so like let's try to work out a deal for this player. Whereas Space Station, you know, maybe they have had some crossover, especially with Halo. You know, I'm certain that there's crossover between Halo in the CDL, but maybe it's not nearly as much, and their expertise is certainly not nearly there with the CDL. To your point, they'd probably, you know, it'd be beneficial to, you know, sign up with some kind of challengers organization or people that have been kind of involved in either the CDL or challengers spaces over the years. But ultimately, they're still at a major disadvantage. They still don't have the connections. They don't have the trust. They don't have the brand that some of these organizations have, where OpTic could probably offer less money to players, and players would take it because it's OpTic versus, you know, going to the Falcons or something, where you might not be as well known, but you might make a little bit more money. Also, the buyouts, who knows if like how bad the buyouts are in Halo versus the CDL. We've heard about, you know, the fact that Fire had to pay his own buyout, and that seems to be more a Carolina thing, but it definitely does seem to be more of like maybe the Wild Wild West now in this current CDL format, where the CDL isn't tied into the salaries and they're not really overseeing a lot of these things, and they're a lot more hands off. And granted, I don't know that much about like the way that Halo is currently run. I know that there have been like some praise put on Halo for their partnership program that they did, where they brought in all of these like legacy organizations to be like official like pro league partners for Halo the last few years. But at the same point, like this has been a complete off season. Like literally, they haven't had a season for Halo this year, so that's not great. And you know, it certainly probably exacerbated some of the issues that those organizations are running into. But you know, I did want to say like to that point, I think that unit maybe has some kind of reason to be correct in that, like, you know, the talent isn't there right when you come into the CDL. It takes like multiple years. Whereas if you had like a draft, for example, like you might be able to hit on a Mercules one year, like because you just kind of get lucky. Or if there's some kind of a Luka this year, a team that just comes in the league, they might be able to draft a Luka and kind of get the best out of him as like an 18, 19-year-old guy versus, hey, like we got to pay for this 28-year-old like player who's been like back and forth between challengers in the CDL, and like let's hope that his 6th time in the CDL will be the charm, you know, that he'll be able to actually do something here. So I think that there's, you know, a point to be made there. Whether I entirely agree with it, who knows, but I think there could be a point. But as far as the liability goes, I think we both said this, like, you know, I think it was $6.8 million maybe for the Surge. That was like the rumored price, or the rumored debt that the Surge or one of the organizations that the Stallions were talking to. So nearly $7 million. No CDL spot is worth $7 million. I think we both have agreed on that. It wasn't worth $25 million, which, you know, that was obvious back in 2019 or whatever it was. But it's not worth like a fraction of that now, because the CDL, and I've said this before, like when you're talking about mergers and acquisitions, in theory, what you're paying for is not past performance. It's not based on like how many viewers they had for last champs or last major, or how much money they made last year as a team. What you're paying for is how much money can you make next year? How much money can you make in 5 years, in 10 years? Is the investment in the future going to be worth it, worth the cost that you're paying right now? Not about what happened in the last 5 years. And I think, you know, I mean, if Daniel Ty's correct in that they're growing 10% every year, double digits every year, then like, of course it'll be worth it. Like in 10 years, it'll be like worth, I don't know, $700 billion. I don't know. Like it to me, it is very clear that the CDL spot is worth something in theory because it is scarce, because there are only 12 of them, but that's the only reason that it's worth anything. And I think that is something to keep in mind, as more of these teams probably at least kick the wheels on joining the CDL. Like they're going to find out like, hey, these teams aren't making money, and are we going to be able to make money? Are we so much better, so much bigger, so much more efficient than all these other esports organizations? Are we going to be able to make the money back to justify spending even $3 million, even $5 million? Like I don't think that's the case. I think that these other organizations are probably going to find that it's a lot easier and more financially responsible to go to Rocket League, to go to Halo, to maybe go into Valorant, especially if this tournament thing ends up actually making it more of an open system. So yeah, that I think there are some pretty key points, and I think this is like a really big PR kind of blow to the CDL for someone to actually come out and say like, yeah, this thing's a liability, not an asset, when they're trying to get millions of dollars for it. Let's move on to the matches, shall we? Right? I think that was the only thing left to talk about. What weird matches, I will say, this weekend. You know, not the first few. I think that kind of went according to plan. But man, it gets a little bit weird toward the end of Friday, and then Saturday really starts to get weird. So let's start with these first two matches. I think they're pretty similar in nature. We had two top teams versus two bottom teams, OpTic versus Boston to start on Friday, May 1st, and then we had LAT versus C9. OpTic, they win the first two maps pretty convincingly. They lose the Overload, which is a little dicey to say the least, against Boston. And then they, really close match in map 4. They win 250-227 to take the series 3-1. This, of course, is another loss for Boston, who have not really looked any better. In fact, they might be looking a little bit worse than they were before the roster change to bring in Afro. And then, of course, OpTic, they continue to win, and I think expectedly so. Any thoughts on this OpTic versus Boston series to start?
Yeah, I will just say it was kind of weird how it ended, especially after the, pretty convincing stomp in map 1 and then a 6-3 win in the SMD. I was thinking about this being like a quick 3-0, and then Boston wins the Overload, and it's a 23-point hardpoint win in the map 4 for OpTic. So the last two maps much closer than the first two maps. We'll get to Boston's other series later on, but that's kind of the opposite of what happened to end Boston's week. But yeah, strangely, a little more interesting towards the end than the first maps potentially suggested it might be. But OpTic wins as you kind of assumed, and yeah, I mean, we mentioned it previously talking about Purge, so just gotta at least bring it up. He went positive in the series, which has been something that's been a topic of discussion, and he was 87 and 86, so he went positive by one
There we
kill,
go.
and he did it against arguably the best team in the league. So you could argue this is potentially his best performance of the year. I know that when Aches did the thing on the flank, he had like a 1.4 KD against C9 or something like that. So I guess technically this isn't his best statistical performance, but considering the caliber of team this KD comes against, I will say this has my vote for the best Purge performance so far of the season. Obviously, that's a small consolation prize that doesn't mean jack shit, but is what it is.
And then we had LAT versus C9. Kind of similar series here as well. LAT, they win very decisively in the first two maps. I will say though, them winning Gridlock S&D 6-1 was pretty shocking, to be honest. Like, because we talked about like what are the odds that C9 would actually win the S&D in this series, and I thought, yeah, they probably will win the S&D and they'll lose 3-1. And instead, the overload was really what it came down to. It was an incredibly close overtime win for LAT, so they end up sweeping here, but probably one of the more promising overload performances of the year for the C9 roster, I would say. Do you agree with that?
I will take it in the opposite direction and say this is. I'm just gonna say this over the OT in particular was a classic example of this C9 team just like not really understanding the fundamentals or not like I'm not gonna preach the fundamentals on overload because I've literally played 0 competitive minutes of overload since I haven't played ranked play at all. I did, however, turn on my PlayStation for the first time in a couple months and play some pubs with head Ego Chall correspondent Tremi. Got the NPC class from him, played 4 or 5 maps with it. Thing shreds. I didn't even have all the attachments for it because I had prestiged the NPC, so like I had to re-level it up a little bit. Little tangent there, but yeah, I did enjoy the NPC from the few maps that I played with my non-fully Shotzi build because that's what Tremi was going to give me for the NPC. Anywho, the overtime in particular here, the way it worked out with C9 capturing in the first half of overtime in 35 seconds. They highlighted this on the flank and went over it. So if you watch that, they might have a little bit more of an analytical breakdown. So I suggest tuning into that. But basically, to sum it up, like all Cloud9 had to do in that first round or in that second round of OT was just not get squad wiped and let LAT just do what they wanted on the map and run one in 21 seconds. And that's literally what happened. Like, if they just all ran together, I'm pretty sure this is like how Parasite explained it. If they just like traded in mid map instead of like sitting back in their spawn or playing super defensive or something like that, if they just got a little aggressive, not even like uber aggressive, but just like a normal break off in the middle of the map, and like even if they get blooded, you trade that kill and then that guy gets traded back and forth a little bit to like the point where it's like a one-on-one. If the deaths were just like staggered a little bit or they were able to trade effectively, LAT just objectively had no time to win that round. But just the way that it shook out and the way everything happened was exactly what LAT needed to win in that golden goal scenario and capture so quickly. So I forget how you said it, and that might, not necessarily be totally the point you were trying to make, but my point here is that overtime in particular from Cloud9 seemed to be an example to me of just like these players on Cloud9. They have their individual moments here and there, different maps, different modes, etc. But just as a team and a collective unit, they just haven't figured it out yet and how to be successful in the CDL, and that's a part of the reason why they've struggled so much.
Yeah, my point was just that they made it to OT, but then I think you made a good point that the stuff that they did in OT actually kind of negates like everything they did to that point, where it's like you did.
I won't. I mean,
It's
that's literally less than a minute of action in
yeah. I mean,
overtime.
it's
So I
like,
guess it shouldn't totally discredit the first 10 minutes, but
it's like if the Browns, for example, and they have done this many times, like they are very competitive with the best team in the NFL for 58 minutes, and then the final 2 minutes they get a sack, they fumble it and it's returned for a touchdown, and then they throw an interception and they muff a punt, and then they get called for holding. Like then people come away from that game, rightfully so, saying like, yeah, this is the Browns is the Browns, as Juju Smith-Schuster once quite famously said. But like that is what people come away from this map. I think maybe they'll be like, well, at least they went to overtime, they forced overtime. But to your point, like it's kind of all for naught because they got swept in this series, and what we expected to happen or what we thought might be the most likely option, which was them winning S&D and then just trying to win one of the respawns to force another S&D in this series, that never came to fruition because Encourage he dropped a donut on Gridlock S&D, went 0-6, and Scrap and Hydra went 17-4 combined, and it was just like an absolute one-way traffic. It was really bad. But then the overload, like it's just they can't win respawns, and I think when you can't win either one of the respawns consistently, like you get in these scenarios where like we're not surprised by any means that they got swept. Like it's a little surprising that they weren't able to pull out the S&D, or that wasn't the close map of this series. But at the end of the day, like this is just not a good team, and we kind of get what we get with C9, and we'll talk about them I think a little bit later as well. But just not a very good performance overall from Cloud9 as we expect. But this is exactly what you want from LAT, like other than that overload being close and getting capped in 35 seconds in the first part of the overtime. Like that's not great for the Thieves, but overall them sweeping C9 in the way that they did is very promising for a team that I think we're both kind of hoping has turned the corner, is actually like a true contender as they come out of this minor championship. And then we had the next series on Friday, which is FaZe versus Carolina. And this was exactly the opposite. Like this was a FaZe. I think we just had the conversation for both of these matches because they're kind of both baffling in a way. So FaZe, they win Major 2. They obviously, like we put them as like the best team or one of the top 2 teams coming out of that second major. And then they lose to Miami in the minor last week. And then they have this really close match with Carolina in the first one, the first match, or their first match, excuse me, of this weekend. They lose the opening hard point. They win by 1 point in overload. They lose both hard points, so they lose that second hard point as well. And then they have to go to a round 11 to beat Carolina in this series. And then in their second match of this week, they get beat by Miami again. So 2 weeks in a row, the Heretics have won against FaZe. And not only that, the second hard point was an absolute fucking curb stomp. It was 250-87. When is the last time FaZe, whether it be Atlanta FaZe or FaZe Vegas, has been 100 point clubbed? Like that's kind of ridiculous for a team that has historically been one of the best in the CDL, have been really good at all 3 game modes that haven't been like a real weak point, at least consistently. And Miami just smoked them. They beat them by nearly 100 in the first hard point. They beat them in overload, and then they beat them 250-87 in the second hard point. So I come out of this, the kind of details of these 2 series, and I pose to you, what the hell is wrong with FaZe? Is this something to actually worry about moving forward out of 2 losses in the last 2 weekends and almost 3 losses they could have certainly lost to Carolina as well?
I'm not falling for it again. My whole motto coming into this Major 3 cycle was I was not going to let these online matches impact my opinions on certain teams, and obviously, got to do a little give and take with that. But in particular with FaZe, we saw them struggle during portions of the online qualifiers ahead of Major 2. Talks about 04 needing to be dropped or replaced, yada yada. They flip that around, go to LAN, win a tournament, and 04 is the MVP. Apparently, allegedly, purportedly, there were ping issues in both of these series for FaZe this weekend. I am not going to like fully allow that to be used as an excuse and totally discredit what the other teams did against FaZe. But I do think it is worth mentioning. It also led to a hilarious back and forth between Benjay and Abuza, which I was a gigantic fan of. Um, but in particular with the Carolina series, I mean, it took Simp setting the kill record for S&Ds in a Black Ops 7 series to come away with a Game 5 Round 11 victory in both hard points, as long as my notes are accurate, and I assume they are. I don't think Drazo went 28 and 28 in map 4. Every other FaZe player was negative in both hardpoint maps. And they obviously lost both those hard points. So obviously, FaZe wins the Carolina match, but the hard point is a concern. And in the takeaway from that, still online is what it is. Simp, strong performance. There was literally in the round 11 though. I think it was 04 maybe. Simp like team killed 04 because he was lagging on his screen in front of him, and Simp just like got a 3-piece anyway. And I think it was either a 3-piece with 04 or he got 3 kills plus 04. So, maybe a 4-piece, however you want to look at it. I don't remember the exact numbers there, but you saw 04 or whoever it was, their body literally was pixelating and going back and forth. So, not going to let the ping stuff be a total scapegoat or anything like that. Cloud9, we'll get to in a second too. Even Encourage tweeted something after Cloud9 played Carolina, and it's seemingly something that even Exceed replied to Encourage and said you have 2 guys in Texas and they were playing on a Texas server, but Carolina does not have a facility. They got players playing from all different locations. That's seemingly impacting the ping in their matches. So that's just something we're going to have to keep an eye on and keep in mind for Carolina's online matches the rest of the way. But yeah, and then it gets to the FaZe Miami series. Draza literally says I'm not going to lose to these guys. I'll do a giveaway if we do lose to them. And he has to end up giving away a $2,000 PC because they lose to Miami once again, which is pretty funny. One positive though, FaZe 3-0 in S&D on the weekend, but 0-4 in hardpoint, and I think it was another example there in this Miami series. Again, if my notes are accurate, Abuza would have went 24 and 24 map 1 hardpoint against Miami. Then everyone else is negative in maps 1 and 4, and the only player who's not negative in a hardpoint this weekend went neutral. So. Something we'll have to keep an eye on for FaZe. I'm not throwing up a red flag, being super nervous about it or anything like that. I think, especially given what happened to Miami later in this weekend, I still need to see Miami do it on LAN. If Miami shows up to Major 3 and beats FaZe on LAN at Major 3, I will, fully be yeah, I mean, maybe we do got to go back and revisit some of those earlier matches from online and give more credit where credit's due, even though I'm not trying to discredit what Miami did or what Carolina did in their attempt to upset FaZe. But yeah, not totally worried about FaZe. It's definitely, something we got to talk about because it happened and they lost. I mean, feels like the way I'm wording it, they got chokeslammed by 2 teams, but they did end up salvaging the weekend and going 1-1. So it is what it is. Still think FaZe is a good team, especially if Ping had a major impact on the game, which we saw at clear evidence of from a viewer perspective in the Game 5 Round 11 against Carolina. I'm not, throwing everything out the window, but I guess we got to just be mindful of that heading into LAN and the rest of these online matches.
I will give them a pass for this weekend. They play OpTic next weekend, so I don't know how that'll go because their FaZe is certainly not looking nearly as strong online as they did at Major 2. And we have to also at least mention the meta is this is a different meta and how teams are kind of reacting to it. But like you said, especially with that Carolina match, at least the ping like certainly could have been an issue. So maybe we kind of hand wave that one. Them losing back-to-back weeks to Miami is a little concerning. I will admit, like even when Miami got the second seed in the Major 2 qualifiers, I think they only went like 6-5 or 7-4. So it wasn't like they were dominant by any means. It was just like everybody else is just like dog shit in those qualifiers. So like with Miami, maybe they've turned a corner. We've talked about that so many times before that I feel like it's something to keep note of. It's something to at least mention. But like you said, like Miami's going to have to prove it once they actually get to land. And FaZe, in a way, is probably going to have to prove it that they aren't good at land, because we kind of did the same thing with Paris and we've done with OpTic, where, you know, they haven't looked great online at certain points, but then they get to the major and they're back. Like they're the team that we thought they could be, or at least somewhat close to being. So I will say that FaZe, I'm not completely writing them off or anything, but you know, it could have been a real absolute disaster, honestly, if they lost to Carolina, because that would have been a loss to Miami, then 2 losses this week. They play OpTic next week, which is a very reasonable thing to think that they'll lose. So like 4 straight losses and 3 straight weeks of like not having any wins, it would just be like really, really bad going into those final few weeks of the qualifiers. But, you know, they kind of avoid that with the round 11 win. I also think that Simp, like he played so well. He played extraordinarily well. So much so that I think he should be able to punch each one of his teammates if they had lost the round 11 with him dropping a CDL record in 2 maps. I think he should have been able to uppercut all 3 of his teammates just as like retribution for making him go through that. But yeah, it was kind of like the Simp show in that series. He didn't have like a great showing against Miami, but it is what it is. And again, we'll kind of hand wave them. We'll kind of say like, all right, like, you know, it's not the end of the world, but we've gone through this with FaZe before and in some of those top teams that we say this and then it actually turned into a much bigger issue at the end of the day.
And I will say with Miami too, we went through this exact thing with them last qualifiers. We literally had a whole show where we're like, is Miami the second best team in the top contender to the OpTic team that was looking untouchable in the Major 2 qualifiers? And then we didn't even get to see Miami play on the main stage at Major 2 because of like the Delta or the Bravo stream and them playing on the secondary stream or whatever, and then they lost to Gentlemates, I believe.
Yeah, I believe so.
So yeah, I mean, credit to Miami. My whole thing with Carolina this year has been I am still rooting for them to somehow make it the champs without winning a single match on land before champs. This would have been a big online win en route to that. But yeah, with both Miami and Carolina, they inarguably have had more success online this year than they have on land. And for FaZe, you could argue the opposite, that they've had more success on land than they have online this year. So, yeah, I'm just not ready to, you know, throw up a white flag or anything with FaZe over this week in particular.
We should, the Saturday, May 2nd, we should actually call this first match like the White Flag Invitational. The Carolina Royal Ravens versus Cloud9 New York. Just one of the absolute worst matches that you could possibly imagine subjecting yourself to in the CDL's history, other than like the current Boston Breach versus C9. Like that's also kind of like a form of torture that the Geneva Convention, I think, outlawed many years ago. But yeah, we had this match to start Saturday. And, you know, we were obviously coming off of the end of Friday. Carolina just goes right down to the wire with FaZe, one of the best teams defending Major 2 champions. Then they play the team that is in dead last, that have not been able to win any like respawns basically to save their lives. And they kind of went exactly how you thought it might go. Like Carolina wins all 3 respawns. Granted, that second hard point was about as close as you can get. 250-247 win for the Ravens, but otherwise C9, they get their, you know, traditional S&D win. They got at least one this weekend. They get stomped in the overload. They get stomped in that opening hard point, and they lose this 3-1. Any overall thoughts on, I think, just kind of a useless series in all seriousness? Like Carolina doesn't feel that way because this is kind of the stuff that they need to get to champs without winning any land matches. But at the same point, like this is exactly what you expect out of these 2 teams in a way.
Yeah, I will argue that this was there were definitely some matches this weekend that were just blah,
Hmm.
unnecessary to tune into or anything. And while you could definitely argue this one didn't have significant ramifications on the league standings or anything like that, you could argue that Cloud9 was a heroic fire three-piece away from going to a game five, and then based on how they've played in Search and Destroy this season as a unit, as well as winning the Search previously in this series, Cloud9 was a fire three-piece away from potentially winning this match. So, um, I think it is worth mentioning. I didn't mention it when we were just talking about FaZe Carolina, but they won Colossus Hardpoint, and they were 0-9 on Colossus Hardpoint before they beat FaZe. So that was their first Colossus Hardpoint win of the season. And then they won Colossus Hardpoint again against Cloud9. So Carolina went 2-0 on the weekend on a map that they were previously 0-9 on. Something to keep in mind there, regardless of who the wins were against. I mean, one's against the Major 2 champion and one's against the worst team in the league, so do with that information as you will. Uh, Cloud9 winning the search against Carolina definitely makes a lot more sense just based on Carolina being a newer team with fire and the way Cloud9 have played. Search as a unit, not surprising there, but yeah, like I said, that defining moment really in the series came down to the uh, Fire's heroics at the end and allowing Carolina to close out in map 4. And if Cloud9 somehow stole that game 4, forced a game 5, and we're sitting here talking about Carolina losing 2 series, uh, 3-2 on the weekend, going 0-4 in Surge potentially, I don't know. I think a Carolina loss to C9 would have I'm pretty much as far out on Carolina as anyone can be at this point, but that would have been the final nail in the coffin for me for sure.
At that point, they should be automatically relegated, and Space Station should get their spot free of charge. I think that's the only way to solve that kind of issue. It just, it is what it is. Like C9, you can give them credit for how they played in the second hard point. You can also just say Carolina is the fact that this was remotely close in the second hard point when C9 hasn't been able to win anything respawn related is just all right, guys. It's almost like is this a good for C9 or bad for Carolina? I could argue a little bit of both. Either way, again, this is basically the matches that Carolina has to win. There's no other option for them. If they're not going to be able to make runs on land, this is really the only way that they can get the champs is by farming wins against C9 and Boston and some of these bottom teams, and then occasionally getting a win over the 6th or 7th or 8th best team. So, Carolina, congrats to them. I think that it's going to be a really hard rest of the road for them in just general. They the Colossus hardpoint stuff. I don't know if they'll probably win another one. It just feels like they got FaZe, and then it was almost a given that they were going to beat C9 on the map once they got there on Saturday. But they win this one. They do go 1-1. It could have went 2-0, and that would have been pretty big. But like you said, they also could have went 0-2. So a lot of different ways that these series could have went for Carolina. We already talked about Miami versus FaZe, so we'll jump down to Vancouver versus Falcons, which it was pretty one-sided, one of the more dominant showings for the Falcons this season, at least in recent memory. They win the first hard point 251-13. The second hard point was 250-148. They win the Surge. The only loss was 4-2 Overload, in which Nero dropped 32 kills. But this was very one-sided, very impressive in the sense that Falcons didn't blow it, but that's also quite a low bar considering that this roster should not be in that scenario. We shouldn't have to think that they're going to choke these matches. Of course, they lost to Vancouver in the Major 2 qualifiers, very kind of infamously after beating OpTic. So at least they won this one. Any kind of overall thoughts coming out of this series?
I'll just kind of loop in the Vancouver LAT match to start Sunday too. Vancouver was 2-0 heading into the minor last week, but obviously 2-0 in the Major 3 qualifiers. They play this Falcons team that they played in the first round of the minor too. I predicted Vancouver to win that first matchup against Falcons in the minor based on how they looked to start off these qualifiers. Gwyn moving to the SMG looked more like Rookie of the Year Gwyn. But then they obviously lose to Falcons in the minor, and they lose to them here once again outside of a win in the overload, pretty convincing as you alluded to as well. And then basically the same thing in the LAT series, like 9-point win in map 1 where Vancouver blew a 100-point lead, which I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, in the minor map 1 against Falcons, they still won, but they almost blew a massive lead. That was on Den Hardpoint against Falcons. It was definitely map 1. I just don't remember the exact numbers, and I'm too lazy to pull up the notes from last week. But outside of that, like 6-0 triple donut from Vancouver in the S&D map 2 against LAT. And then they just simply win an 8-1 overload. I was like, what the hell is going on here? How does that make any sense to go from a map where literally 3/4 of the team didn't get a single kill to winning 8-1 in the overload? I was mind blown, but then it was right back down to earth with a 100+ point win for LAT in the map 4 hard point. So pretty, again, kind of some highlight reel moments for better or worse from Vancouver in both of their matches. But at the end of the day, they go from 2-0 in the Major 3 qualifiers to 2-2. Still should have a shot in theory for a winner's bracket spot at 2-3 with some tiebreakers and stuff. But that's what the last week will solidify for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you kind of expect. Like, even coming out of that 2-0 weekend, we were saying, like, okay, like, what does that actually mean? You know, the two matches that they played, you can argue that, you know, it's not that impressive, at least for most teams. Granted, for Vancouver, it's impressive because they had, like, I don't know, 7 wins total before that. So, you know, that was a considerable portion of their total wins for this season. But at the same point, like, they have to play better teams, and now they've lost a few matches in a row. This roster change hasn't gone. I mean, we'll see. I guess if they get the winner's bracket spot, we can argue that it actually did work out. But if they don't, and then they get first rounded again at a tournament, then we might be like, all right, like, was it worth it? Like, you know, what was Capsule maybe a better option here, or do you have to make other changes? Because I felt that way. Like, if you're gonna get rid of Cap, like, you should probably just get rid of like TJ as well, probably, and then just try to see what else is out there. But you know, they seem to be, you know, a little bit satisfied. They're just not a good team, and unfortunately, they're just in that spot where, kind of in the same vein as Carolina, that they can make runs by just beating the bottom tier teams. But of course, they played LAT, and the Falcons are not like a bottom tier team. They can be, certainly. They've shown the ability to kind of sink down to that level, but in general, their talent is much, much higher. So yeah, Vancouver, they go 0-2. I have no idea like how 3 players on a single team drop donuts. Like, that's kind of ridiculous at the CDL level, but I'm glad that we got to see that, just to know that it is possible. Yeah. And then to finish out Saturday, we had Toronto versus OpTic, which was like complete opposite of what we've seen from like Falcons and Vancouver and all that. Like, these are actually 2 pretty good teams. Obviously, OpTic is a great team, you know, 2-time defending world champions, and Toronto has certainly made a leap seemingly over the last like 6 weeks as well, and found their groove. And this was a very competitive series. Went to a game 5. Toronto actually wins the opening hardpoint and the overload, and have a chance if they could just win one of those last 2 maps, or win an S&D, which would be very nice. But OpTic actually wins both of the searches 6-3, and then they win that second hardpoint 250-159. This is also, I think we should loop in, like, I said that Simp should be able to uppercut his teammates if they lost. I think Joe should be able to uppercut his teammates for this loss. He drops 39 kills in the first hardpoint. He drops 38 kills in the overload. He drops 38 kills in the second hardpoint, and he drops 9 in the game 5 S&D loss. A swift uppercut, maybe even to the nuts, for each of his teammates in this, because that is absolutely ridiculous to drop nearly 40 kills in all of the respawns, nearly drop 10 kills in game 5, and those S&Ds weren't even like particularly close. Just a really, really bad performance by Toronto, just not to be able to win this series with how well he played. How did you feel coming out of this series, Toronto versus OpTic?
Yeah, definitely like post-match moment, like as you were just talking, and I know you mentioned that OpTic's gonna play FaZe next week. I immediately just went to jot it down. Like OpTic winning both S&Ds against Toronto here is definitely noteworthy, going against the FaZe team, which just went 3-0 in S&D, but struggled in hardpoint. That could uh, push that OpTic versus FaZe match more in favor of OpTic than some people might think, depending on or based on how the Major 2 Grand Finals went. But that's a topic for a later show. Just, yeah, based on this Toronto series, definitely feel for Joe. I think even like Octane tweeted something to the effect of like, "I'm sorry, Joe," like, or "I feel bad," or whatever the case may be. Like, it's pretty funny. Aches went on another legendary rant about Insight, and like the same thing we've talked about before, where he's basically saying like Toronto's playing 3v4. Got to get rid of him. I put in the notes like this felt like to me, even without looking at the stats, that this is possibly Kips's worst series since he entered the CDL. I would have to go back and look. I know at Major 2 they played uh Toronto played OpTic as well, and they like when Toronto obviously went on their run with the insight magic and everything like that, they said like Kips was getting more acclimated to playing on LAN and stuff. So regardless of the exact numbers, with the eye test and just impact in the series, and especially compared to what I've thought about Kips so far since he's done into the CDL, this definitely felt like to me his potential worst match so far. Just unfortunate it comes at a time when it's against a good team like OpTic. But again, I mean, superstar performance from Joe, MVP, all-star caliber performance out of him. Better showing from Toronto than we just saw. Again, similar to the Vancouver versus Falcons, we saw Toronto play OpTic during minor one
Mm-hmm.
last week, and Toronto lost that 3-1. So it takes a MVP 1.4 KD caliber performance out of Joe Deceives to push it a little further, but still not across the finish line in terms of defeating OpTic. And then yeah, like I said, even if this is technically one of Kips's worst performances, he still had a slightly higher KD than Insight, which just doesn't uh, bode well for Insight at all. But I think this is something we've talked about now multiple times at this point. It seems like that ship has sailed on replacing him at this point in the season. Maybe if they bomb out of Major 3, they'd make a move, but I would be even shocked if they did that at this point. Um, Seems like to me, like at least based on this this match, I wouldn't be surprised if Joe gets himself a quite handsome bag and is not on Toronto uh, after this season, as we've seen other players, like Scrap and
Mm-hmm.
uh, move on when they're able to get the bag, for lack of a better term, from some of these other teams. So that'll be definitely something in the off season to keep an eye on, but not there quite yet. Obviously, good of OpTic to close this out, show up in the S&Ds, get a win in a series where Mercules is the only player who goes negative, and even the guys who were positive, like Dashy's +3, Hook +3, or sorry, Dashy +5, Hook and Shotzi +3, and Mercules is -6. So like for in a series where you lose 2 respawns with a hardpoint and overload, you win searches. You obviously expect that to be influencing the KDs, and that certainly seems like the point for OpTic here. But they're able to clutch it out. We saw him play a couple of new maps, specifically Plaza. I think Plaza S&D does bode well for OpTic, at least on paper, and at least what I saw from them here, because like Hook and Shotzi can be an uber aggressive SMG duo if they need to be. They can also be super strategic, like time their nades into the bomb site. They had a retake in one. Did they play Plaza in their other match? They did play Plaza in the Boston match, so I might be mixing up which map this happened on, but there was one of those instances they had a pretty solid retake in that club bomb site. That's there's 3 ways in, and if you have the players alive, you can obviously look at all 3 entrances. But if you don't have at least 3 people alive, there's one way that's technically open, and if you're able to time it right and stuff. There was one instance that definitely I was impressed by what OpTic was able to do as a retake on that bomb site. But yeah, that's definitely something, I guess, worth mentioning here too. Especially OpTic played Plaza S&D twice, won it both this weekend. Maybe working on the map pool a little bit, and obviously with map pool changes like that, that's something that could bode well for them going into Major 3.
I think with Toronto especially, this is a big loss, just in the sense that they very easily could have went 5-0 in these qualifiers. They played probably the easiest schedule of any team in these qualifiers. They, other than OpTic, their toughest match was against the Falcons. They played the Falcons last week in Boston. Obviously, Boston's really bad. Then they played OpTic. There's the only match this week. And then next week, Toronto plays Vancouver and C9. So, like, it was almost a guarantee that they were going to go at minimum 3-2, probably 4-1, just because Falcons have been very hit or miss. And then if, they were able to pull out this win, obviously they would at worst get probably like a second seed. Like maybe LAT could get a tie for the number 1 seed or somebody like that. But other than that, like, it really was kind of theirs to win. And of course, like you said, it took Joe having like this Herculean performance for them to get to game 5 to win those 2 maps. And I think that just doesn't bode well for Toronto in general. Like, maybe it'll be different on LAN, of course. And, not saying that it's like a given that they'd be able to beat OpTic on LAN, or that that's even something that should be expected of them. But they're going to need to beat a team like OpTic or a team like FaZe to win championships. And I would assume that's kind of what they're trying to go for in Toronto. That's historically what they've been striving for. And the fact that it took Joe dropping like 120 kills or whatever it was in 3 maps and then nearly dropping 10 in the game 5, and they still lose. I just don't think that is a good sign for where Koi is in relation to the very top teams in the league. And I think that they might be kind of hitting their ceiling in some ways. And we're seeing that in something like this, even though it is kind of a relatively meaningless online match. They'll probably still go 4-1 in the qualifiers. They'll still get like a 2nd or 3rd seed at Major 3. But for me, it is a little bit worrying that it just, him having this kind of performance didn't result in them winning. On the flip side, OpTic, it's a very good thing, like that they were able to withstand how well Joe played and were able to still win this series. I get to your point, them winning 2 S&Ds a week before they play both Paris and FaZe. So OpTic has like the inverse. Like, so Toronto has Vancouver and C9, and then OpTic has Paris and FaZe. I think it's very realistic that both of those teams will go 2-0. Of course, it'll just mean so much more if OpTic goes 2-0, and we'll definitely, I think, probably if they do go 2-0, come out of that week and say OpTic is the team to beat going into Major 3, especially because they would beat FaZe, and FaZe would have lost like almost every single match in the last like 4 weeks. But just trying to say that OpTic should feel pretty good about this win. Playing Boston meant nothing in the beginning of the week. It is what it is. But them beating Toronto and being able to win both of those searches, I think, is a very good sign for them and where they are going into the final week of the qualifiers. I just don't know about Toronto and whether they'll be able to come out of this and feel good about it, I guess. So we talked about Vancouver and LAT already. Miami versus G2, like, what a fucking shit show. Like, who knows like what we're doing here anymore, because Miami beats FaZe in back-to-back weeks. And early in the show, we talk about how Miami is like, maybe they turned a corner, or like maybe we need to see a little bit more of them. After this match, I did not want to see any more of Miami just in general. I wanted them to cease to exist as an organization, because Miami has been up and down, but G2 has been even more up and down, so much so that we've basically been like, we're out on G2. We don't want to pick them anymore. It's so annoying to watch them because we know that they can be so much better and so much more consistent. And then they pull out some shit like this where they 3-0 Miami on the same week that Miami beat up on FaZe. And I just don't know what to do with either of these teams. It's more disappointing for Miami, of course, because they lost this series, and all of the goodwill I think that they had kind of rebuilt over these last few weeks just kind of went out the window. And I'm almost back to where I started with the Heretics. And that's like, when is Real coming here? Because I can't do this anymore where, you're just, it's very selfish of them to make me have to think about these matches as much as I do. I should be able to look at this match and be like, of course Miami will win. Not they get 3-0'd. And that's what happened here. Of course, they were pretty close maps. Like overall, that it was a round 11 S&D win. It was a 3-2 overload win for G2, but this was still a 3-0, and you can't overlook that. Like even online matches, like you have to at least take these matches and the results into account. And I just don't know what to do with either of these teams. How do you feel as someone who has been very out on G2, has been very skeptical of Miami? How do you feel coming out of this 3-0 G2 Minnesota win?
I would say I've been less skeptical of Miami than you, at least in recent times. But
they've hurt me so much more.
I mean, this is just like so. Like I'm almost speechless at this point. It's just unfathomable, and maybe my entire tune is much more different about Miami versus FaZe, or Miami beating FaZe, if Miami just took care of business against G2. I will say I wasn't even thinking about the Real aspect of Miami, and I will just throw it out there. One thing we didn't mention in the Miami versus FaZe series is Metals did have the most kills in both hardpoint wins for Miami against FaZe. So obviously Metals has been like the name associated with the Real rumors. If they are to insert him into the lineup, the speculation is that it would be to replace Metals. There's also been the speculation around Trakes, though, so it's just worth mentioning that Metals actually did play pretty well in a win against FaZe. On the other hand, in this series against G2, though, I mean, nobody really played well for Miami. Obviously, Rencor has a 1.22, so I shouldn't really say that, but yeah, it's just I cannot believe that G2 got away with this. I shouldn't say I can't believe it, because this is like the most G2 thing they can do, is just when you fully discount them and fully don't expect anything from them, they just pull off a 3-0 against a team that you do not expect them to be anywhere close to 3-0ing. So yeah, I mean, to G2's credit, Kremplasis is back in the fold, seemingly, potentially, possibly. Like, Krem dropped 35 nap 1 against Miami on Colossus, so that bodes well for the Kremplasis narrative, which seemingly had lost a little bit of luster in recent weeks, and just hasn't had the same impact as like, oh god, these teams are playing Colossus against G2, and we were like crashing out when teams were doing that. It's kind of just been like, yeah, whatever, they're playing them on Colossus, they'll win a couple or lose a couple here and there. It's just another map at that point. But this was a strong performance by Kremp on Colossus, and G2 are able to win it. But then, like you said, those other two maps were close, 6-5 S&D, 3-2 in the overload. But yeah, I mean, 3-0 G2 over Miami, especially given the way Miami had looked recently, and especially like if this happened on LAN, I think I would be a little bit less surprised, just because G2 actually beat FaZe on LAN at Major 1. Like they've I think had better placings because of that on average this season so far than Miami on LAN, despite Miami probably having better success online at overall this season. But regardless, yeah, just definitely was not expecting a G2 3-0 win over Miami, and this could loom large in the standings. We'll get to the Major 3 standings later, but I didn't even realize that G2 and Miami are now both 1-2 in the Major 3 qualifiers.
Do you think it's like a jealousy thing? Like, do you think that Minnesota saw Miami beat FaZe multiple weeks in a row and was like, that's our thing? Like, you can't do that. Like, that's maybe. Like copyright infringement, brother. Like it feels a little bit like what we're getting at. Like, Minnesota seemed almost like dead in the water. Like, we were trending toward like an imminent roster change with them, just to spice something up. And now I wonder if it actually has like the opposite effect of like, now they'll be like, all right, like let's see what we have here, kind of fool themselves into thinking that this is like actually something big, and maybe it is, but it seems more along like the lines of like this is a flash in the pan that Miami is a G2 light, and that they also have these issues where they don't show up for every match and things don't work out. And I can give some teams like some confidence that maybe they shouldn't have. But yeah, this is a really baffling match, and it doesn't really fit into like what we've seen. It's almost kind of like if Carolina had beaten FaZe this week, like, it just doesn't really fit with what you know to be true, or what you think, I guess, to be true in Call of Duty. But that's just like what you said all year long, like that this is a very coin flippy kind of game, and that teams, especially week to week, they can't be really relied on, especially in these online matches. Like they're so fluky and inconsistent, and there's really nothing that you can do about it other than like hope and pray that your pick'em doesn't get absolutely torched by it. But yeah, like, I'd say for us this week, like Miami was involved in both of our like bad pick'ems. Like we went 8-2, and we could have went 10-0 if Miami had the courage, as a very famous line someone said. And then the final match of the weekend was Gentleman's versus Boston, which was kind of almost similar, where it was like this didn't really make any sense how close this series was. Boston actually almost swept this series, and Gentleman's they eke out an overload win 4-3. Then they win 250-157 hard point. Then they decisively win the Surge 6-3. But like this, again, Boston is just not a good team. They're one of the worst teams in the league. Paris, of course, was the Major 1 champions and have looked really off basically for the last 2 months since then. And it almost seemed like this was like kind of a nail in the coffin in some ways, just like to lose to a Boston team that has, if we said G2's dead in the water, I don't even know what the phrase would be for the Boston Breach. Like they're so far out there, and like there's no reason to believe that they can be revived at this point. But man, like this could have been really bad. Of course it doesn't. We'll gloss over this probably in a week or two because Gentlemates were able to win. But how do you feel about Paris and their prospects coming out of like a really tight, maybe too tight of a series?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty worried, especially because at the time of this today, Boston wins the first 2 maps. After we see a G2 Miami sweep, and I'm just thinking in the back of my head, like, we and even you go to the first series of today, there's that 8-1 Vancouver overload win. That's kind of just like making this a little bit of a nuttier day than potentially it should have been, even though LAT obviously closed things out against Vancouver. But nonetheless, like from a Boston perspective, you piece together the first 2 maps here against Gentlemates and the last 2 maps against OpTic to start this weekend. And, if you got to pick and choose 2 maps from 2 different series and put them into one, like that's a decent looking series from a Boston perspective. But obviously 2 of those maps came at the end of one series, and then in this Paris match, 2 of them came at the beginning of the series for Gentlemates. And I think the big difference, obviously, people love to talk about Envoy, the stats, and blah, blah, blah. But very noticeable difference here. Map 1 goes 14-28. Map 4, Envoy goes 38-23. So has almost triple as many kills in map 4 that he did in map 1. So obviously that's not gonna totally put it on Envoy for them losing map 1, but like that's a noticeable difference. It's not like a case of somebody going like -5 and then +5. Like that's like completely flipping the script, for lack of a better term there. So definitely would have been very concerned if Gentlemates had lost this match to Boston. I still think this is slightly more indicative of the Gentlemates we saw post Major 1 as opposed to the Gentlemates we saw at Major 1 or at the very start of the Major 1 qualifiers. But a win is a win at this point, and this is an important one given the schedule they got coming up next week.
And that pick'ems, like I said, we're both 8-2 this week. So you're 113-60. I'm 114-59 on the year, and Shermer is still winless. The standings, like you mentioned, are really crazy because there's only 5 matches for each team, we're going to have like a shit ton of tiebreakers and some really weird stuff happening. Entering the final week, we have 3 teams tied for first place, all at 3-0. LAT, Paris, and OpTic. I think LAT, just based on the schedule, probably has the best chance of going 5-0 and being the number 1 seed, or at least being one of the number 1, like the top teams in the tie for first. Paris and OpTic play each other, so we'll solve that one way or the other this week. And then you have FaZe. They are in 4th place at 3-1. Then Toronto and Vancouver both have 2 wins, but Toronto is 2-1, so they have more opportunities. So they're the 5th and 6th place teams. Then you have the Falcons, Minnesota, and Miami all at 1-2. Carolina is also with 1 win. They're 1-3. So that will decide who gets into the winners bracket. Then you have Boston and Boston C9 at the very bottom. Boston is 0-4, so I think they're pretty much out. Like, I mean, not technically, because you could technically have all these weird tiebreakers, but it does feel like they're out. And then C9, of course, is 0-3, but essentially out because they can't win respawns. So yeah, it's going to be crazy. Like I said, we have OpTic playing both FaZe and Paris this week. LAT has a pretty easy week by comparison. And, I think Gentlemates versus Miami, which is on Sunday, is very exciting. And maybe LAT versus G2 could be exciting if G2 decides to show up for that match. But of course, we'll talk about all of those matches when we're back for our next show. I think that about does it. I didn't actually think we were going to hit an hour and 30 because we stopped talking about the other stuff like maybe 35 minutes in. I was like, there's no way that we're going to talk for like an hour about these matches, but like we're at like 88 minutes coming up. So yeah, we appreciate all of the support, all of the love. We had a few people in the YouTube chat tonight. Shout out to a squad wiper, Nelson Neo, and also those Blizzard 257 and J Bink guys. Shout out to them as well. Appreciate everybody stopping by. I think we're at like 298 subscribers on YouTube. So if you could follow or subscribe to the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on, or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. Like I said, let's try to hit 300 subscribers by Major 3. That would be really awesome. If you want to watch these podcasts live instead of listening after the fact, then you can watch on YouTube, or you can go to twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can follow and subscribe there. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink, twitch.tv/JBink with 2 Ks. He was just streaming before we turned on this stream. So, he's had like months and months and months of consecutive streams. So if you want to tune in, go over there. Follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2 Ks, at Preston Byers, in the podcast stores at Ego Chall Podcast. And shooting for Wednesday as usual for our next live show, which will be May 6th. And we will not be having a live show next Sunday because I'll be out of town. So we'll do something, either we'll combine it on like Wednesday, or we'll do something like Monday or Tuesday and then do a regular show before Major 3. But we'll obviously update you when we go live next week, to, I guess, on Wednesday to talk about that, whatever we decide on. But yeah, I appreciate everybody stopping by. Thank you all for the support. And Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. Shout out everybody from the YouTube chat, like Preston said. Shout out to Squad Wiper too. I was going back and forth with him a little bit in the comments of our last video, talking about the winners bracket advantage or lack thereof, and that age-old debate at this point. So shout out to Squad Wiper. That gave me some good entertainment when I was stuck in the hospital waiting room. But yeah, I mean, like Preston said, we got one more week of matches and some pretty good ones coming up, and could have massive implications on the standings. So should be a good week ahead, and we'll preview all that on Wednesday. And then before you know it, we're right back on LAN in 2 weekends now. So gonna be an exciting time here coming up soon, and I can't wait to break it all down and talk through it with you guys. So thank you guys as always for all the support. Really do appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one. Remember to send the chow.